uh, two aspects actually. One is from the aspect of data and how data has become very, very important for all of us. And second, based on some of the newer technologies, especially AI and machine learning, which is more and more used in the area of cybersecurity. There seems to be a delay between. Okay, so if you look at the news that came out recently, when Twitter was hacked, and about 150 accounts of very, very important people were taken over for a few minutes. Especially if you see on the bottom right, even President Barack Obama's account was taken over. People like Elon Musk, Joe Biden, all these accounts were taken over. There are two messages I want to share in this regard. One, the the accounts of very important people were taken over, and if their accounts are not protected, then what about you and me? Second, Twitter is in the midst of, in the center of the IT ecosystem in the Silicon Valley, and they have the best of the resources. In spite of that, they got hacked, and that also says that if Twitter was hacked, then it's possible that any website can be hacked, any data can be hacked. Now, in this case, what happened was Twitter had allowed about I think 1,500 employees access through an admin app to access the accounts for fixing problems, etc. And it seems the hackers got through to one or two of these employees, we don't know how many, got the access to the admin window, and through the admin window, they were able to change these, take over these accounts. And this is typical, most of the cases, 30 to 40% of the cases, the accounts, the hacking happens through employees within the organization, and that is why sometimes it's actually very, very difficult to prevent hacking. But you can protect based on some of the things that I will talk about. Let me now switch to India. Over the last few months, especially during this pandemic, the cyber attacks in India has actually surged. And the news item in the middle says that India is among the top 5 most targeted by the hackers. And the bottom says that even hospitals are not out of the purview of hackers, actually. Hospitals which are providing life-saving services are also part of the hacking, actually. So they don't discriminate even the most important or most critical resources. All of them are hacked. Again, it says that this is something widespread, and we need to protect ourselves from these hackers. Let me now illustrate through a couple of examples. I won't go into all of them. The challenges that we are faced with. All of us are familiar with the ride-hailing apps like Ola or Uber, etc. Now, if you are able to hack into, let us say, the data from the ride-hailing companies, actually, it tells where all you have traveled, with whom, if you are going to do ride sharing, you have traveled, the timing of your travel, the payment details, And from this, actually, you can actually figure out. Now, if you are, let's say, going to the bank every Monday, right? Because you know from where to where you're traveling, then you can actually um, plan a activity around that. Now, if you are going to a particular shopping area, workspace, they can figure out your work area and things like that. So, with the data, you are able to actually figure out a lot about the individual. And the same is true, if you lose your mobile phone, if your mobile phone gets hacked, in fact, you know, the hackers can get access to your search details, your browsing details, the content that you look at, the friends that you have, the social networking handles that you have, the emails that you have, everything they are able to get access to. If you hack into the neighborhood pharmacy, the medicines that you buy, what illnesses that you have, how many people are there at your home, all kinds of things. And there are positive benefits to public data sets also. If you look at the GST network data, for example, it has about 1 crore MSMEs data from 1 crore MSME, micro, small, medium enterprises. And over that now, there are services being rendered which allows credit facilities to be given, loans to be given to MSMEs, etc. So again, the data is extremely important. It can be put to bad uses, or it can be put to good uses also. So all of us have accelerated the adoption of digital life, especially during the pandemic. And in the context of digital life, and that's the life that we are all of us are using digital more than ever before. So during the pandemic, of course, the adoption has accelerated. And if you look at the devices that we are using to access the internet, access the phone network, and through which, of course, access all the services, access internet and things like that. These devices are manufactured around the world. Supply chains are global. If you look at the iPhone, for example, the components come from all over the world. Actually, finally, it gets assembled in India now, or in China. The chips could come from some place else, typically Taiwan or something like that, and or Korea. Some other components coming from Japan, etc. The apps are another story. Actually, the apps could come from all over the world, and a lot of the apps we don't even check where it's coming from, who is the author, and or which company created this, etc. And again, that's a vulnerability, and lots of apps have backdoor entries and things like that. Increased use of IoT devices, and I have another slide on IoT, so I'll talk about it there. But more and more our lives are now dependent on these IoT devices. Similarly, transaction data, which is voluntary or involuntary. So, for example, the voluntary part of the data is simply for example, the ride-hailing apps, the credit card transaction is a voluntary. We paid for that, but the involuntary is our habits and things like that are all getting logged. If you walk along the street, for example, you may get recorded, video recorded and things like that, right? That's involuntary. You didn't allow for that, but you are already getting recorded. And many places automatically it is tracking you actually. On the cloud, we store now lots and lots of data, personal data. Again, we trust the service provider. but massive amounts of data is being generated by every one of us in the digital life, in this digital world. And we are actually not completely aware of what is happening to this data. So, for example, if you do a search and then you go to let's say Facebook, or you go to a social media network, the ads that are served to you actually follows the search that you did. How did it come to know? That is because the search entity company has sold your browsing information to the social media network so that they can serve appropriate ads and things like that. So this is why it starts spreading. The use of data, is used or misused to serve you. In the future, we are going to have 50 to 60 billion connected devices, appliances, machines, etc. Everything from healthcare to smart factories to intelligent buildings to smart cities, connected cars, drones, security devices that are watching you. Every one of these is actually a uh, a possible vulnerability, and the data from these, and imagine that 50 to 60 billion devices, and all of them manufactured in different parts of the world, components coming from different parts of the world. You don't know who has certified these, etc. All of these are floating around in the future, and all of them are actually logging data about you. Um, and this data is a huge uh, source of services, but also a significant vulnerability. Today, the regulations around the use of data is still not clear. India is in the process of coming out with personal data protection regulations. I myself chair the non-personal data uh, framework committee framing the rules and regulations on non-personal data, and the ownership of this data is still not very clear. Most of us, when we allow, uh, let's say, a particular service to be delivered and it is tracking you, you typically say, I allow. If you think about, when you go to a website and it says it's using cookies, you say yes, or go ahead, right? We don't even go back and check what it's doing with this data, and there's no disclosure also. The personal data in many cases is stored in different countries, actually, not necessarily in India. Um, Data, of course, is a very huge business. If you look at the top 5 companies in the world, companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, all these companies have huge amount of data, and their market cap, their valuation is dependent on how much data that they have. And these are humongous companies with trillion-dollar plus valuations, actually. So there is need for national regulations, and this is what every country is now grappling with, and we in India are also looking at clear regulations on ownership of data. Typically, ownership of the data resides with the data principal, which is the person about whom this data is about, right? The owner of the data is the subject of the data itself, and we need to authorize the use of this data, and we need to authorize for specific purposes, and that's what this regulation will actually specify. And also, more and more, I personally believe that there has to be disclosure based use of data rather than consent based. Yes, consent is okay if the principal, that is you and me, are fully aware of what is being done with this data, but when that's not very clear, the disclosure is probably what is more important. Transparency is what important. And lastly, this is nothing to do with cybersecurity, but it is to do with wealth generation. The wealth generated from this data must accrue to the country, the citizens of that country. So shifting the focus to transparency as a way to level the playing field, ensuring the privacy of the data stays with the data principle. And when you think about data, some of the questions that come to mind are I talked about search. How does it influence online use and tracking? Do you know that what cookies are being used, how it's tracking you? Where all the data traverses and can be potentially captured and tracked. Starting with the router that you have, to the routers on the internet, to the servers on the internet, to service providers on the app and things like that, and it can be actually in different geographical locations. Now, who controls the data? Ideally, it's the data principal, the owner of this data, and he or she must control access to this data. And do you have the access to the data when you need it? For example, you want to actually permit somebody else to use it. So let's look at healthcare records itself, right? You go from one hospital to another hospital. Are you able to take the data with you, or it stays with the first hospital, which is typically the case today, right? When you go to the second hospital, you have to take a printout and take it to the second hospital. Data doesn't automatically travel with you. These are some of the challenges that needs to be addressed when it comes to data. Very quickly, I will just touch upon this. I won't go into details about this because I want to get to AI and talk about AI also. But when it comes to cybersecurity, the data, the people, the example that they gave you about Twitter was about using the people to get access, right? Abuse of authorization, using social engineering to get your user ID, password, etc. Man in the middle who actually kind of captures, captures your data. Also, it's not the person that you want to actually connect with, etc. The infrastructure is a vulnerability. The applications themselves are vulnerable. So let me now go to AI and cybersecurity. Now, see, tools are what enable us to increase our productivity and become better. Now, AI is not a new tool. It's been in use from the 1960s. But what has happened is the new area of AI, which is machine learning, and the newer one is deep learning, which is using brain-like capabilities, brain-like structures of neural networks and things like that, multi-layered neural networks to access vast amount of data. And the difference between the traditional mode of programming and AI is actually very interesting, and that's why I believe this is very fundamental, and it's as disruptive as introduction of digital computers. Actually, see, in the traditional programming, what we do is we feed data, we write out the algorithm, convert that into a program, and using this program and the data, you get the results. The computer produces the result. When it comes to AI ML, what happens is that you have labeled data, tagged data, curated data, and then you also feed the desired results, and the system actually comes out with the algorithm or the program. Now, this is very different paradigm than the traditional paradigm of programming, because you don't need to know how to solve the problem, because the computer figures out how to solve the problem. You feed the sample data and you feed the desired results, and the computer comes back with the algorithm. So if you need to program a computer about face recognition, clearly you can't do that because we ourselves do not know how we recognize faces, etc. But by feeding, let's say, human faces, let's say faces of men, uh, as the desired results, and then feeding all kinds of sample data with men's faces in different angles from different ethnicity and things like that, the computer learns how to recognize faces of men. Next, you feed actually the actual data. Then using this algorithm, the computer is able to recognize faces. And today, the computers are as good as human beings. The results are 97, 98% accurate actually. So pattern recognition, image recognition, speech recognition, translation, these are classes of problems now which the computers can be used to solve actually. And uh, you know for process automation, for surveillance, for enforcing traffic laws, because you can actually recognize um, people who are violating the traffic rules. Uh, the self-driving vehicles, medical diagnosis, for example, recognition of X-ray images and things like that, and widely used actually in medical diagnostics, etc. So these are new problems that are now used to solve using these AI ML systems, etc. Now, the same set of systems can actually be used to solve new types of problems, etc. And in the future, I strongly believe that we are able to um, think about artificial general intelligence. That means computers which are as good as human beings. And this may not be just one machine, it could be a network of machines. And that's how I believe it will happen. Because when we try to emulate nature, when you try to copy something, you don't make exact replicas actually. We actually create new designs and models. For example, if you want to travel from place A to place B, we walk, we run with our legs and things like that. But when you think about, or if you look at birds, they fly using movable wings, right? Flaps. They flap their wings. But when human beings copied this, they created aircraft which have fixed wings, or jet propulsion and things like that. So we copy nature very differently, but we do it much better because today you can actually go from place A to place B at the speed of sound, but carrying 600 plus people, right? So we do much better than nature when we copy nature. Now, the challenge with AI ML, and this is again a vulnerability when it comes to solving cybersecurity related issues, because uh, it's a black box. So we do not know how the system will solve the problem and what algorithm. You get the algorithm, but how does it get that algorithm, how it solves, it's not very clear. Verifiability is a challenge because there is no traceability. The algorithm is as good as the sample data that you fed it, the labels that you've used, the tags that you've used. If there are biases in the data, clearly those biases are also represented. So in the facial recognition example, if you have not used, let's say, uh, white Anglo-Saxon male, it will not recognize white Anglo-Saxon male properly. It will only recognize Indian faces. And similarly, the qualifications of people who are developing these models also matter when it comes to this thing. So, how are we using AI and machine learning when it comes to cybersecurity and things like that? We are using um, AI, because the traditional paradigm is using previous knowledge of attacks. We create algorithms. Now we can actually identify attacks as deviations from normality. That means the deviations from what is normal can actually be used to detect cybersecurity attacks. And here again, there are two modes that you can use. One is defensive AI, and second is offensive. So in the defensive AI, we look at you know, uh, uh, way using AI ML engine to look at malware detection, look at spam, look at vulnerability management to identify vulnerabilities based on people's behavior or the tools they use, etc. Uh, Data classification, and lastly, threat intelligence. Again, looking at behavior and things like that. In the case of offensive AI, and offense in many cases is the best defense actually, especially when it comes to cyber attacks, cyber war and things like that. You can actually use AI to replicate and create malware and attack the other party when they come to attack you using smart botnets. You can use phishing programs and things like that. So capture their uh, uh, programs, etc. And this is the new area in which the whole area of cybersecurity is actually moving to. Um, I'm going to stop here, but there's significant activity in this area. If I look at the number of companies that are emerging and getting funded, this is just a sample list of categories of startups that are coming up in anti-fraud and identity management, mobile security, predictive intelligence, behavior analytics and anomaly detection, app security, IoT security, deception security, very new areas actually, and multi-billion dollars of funding is going into funding startups in these areas actually. So what I wanted to share with you was two perspectives. One, from a perspective of data, and we need to create regulations in India so that we can protect ourselves. We can create regulations on the use of data or misuse of data. We need to specify the ownership of data, and all this requires regulations. All this requires capability building. And the second aspect I wanted to share with you was the new tool of AI machine learning, where we can leverage the power of the computer to solve the problem or to fight misuse, fight hacking, etc. And here again, we need to have the technology, we need to have the capability, and we need to have the tools in order to do that. And I strongly believe that this is something that we need to actually build capabilities, build companies in India. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I do not know whether we have time for questions. If we have, I can take questions. Otherwise, thank you all very much and wish you all the very best for rest of this conference. Thank you.